Hello students, I am Dr. L.K. Das, Assistant Professor of Sociology at the Department of HSS, IIT Roorkee. Welcome to another lecture of the NPTEL course Power and Politics in Contemporary India, a Sociological View. Today we are going to discuss a very significant question in political sociology, which is why do certain movements succeed and others fail? All these 5 weeks we have been discussing different concepts, different frameworks and several examples in order to link those theoretical frameworks and concepts. Today in this lecture, we have a very specific task. The task is to answer this question. And all political sociologists over the past 50-60 years have grappled with this question as to what is political consciousness, how to better understand it, whether political consciousness is linked to social consciousness, if political and social consciousness they are linked to each other, how they are linked to each other, and if there is certain issues in terms of transformation from the being of certain political forces, certain social forces, why most often than not they do not translate to revolutions. So the difference here is between revolution and not the revolutions. So in this, today we will discuss Marx, Weber, Gramsci, Bourdieu and the post-Marxist thought. Particularly when you talk about Bourdieu and others, we call them post-Marxist because they are not only looking at Marx or Gramsci, but they are integrating different aspects of theoretical frameworks emerging from different schools of thought in order to understand society. We will also discuss the significance of consent and coercion, something that we had discussed when we discussed Gramsci previously. And we will also link in this entire discussion with certain examples from contemporary India in terms of class, caste and regional inequalities. Let us begin. When we look at Marx, as we have been discussing since the beginning of this course, Marx spoke in terms of structures or something he calls as base, and this he relates to something called superstructure. Now, base and superstructure, they are rooted in fundamental Marxist analysis of society, of politics, of culture as well as of economy. So, base provides a particular structure through which human beings live their lives, human relationships are formed, as well as how these relationships are linked to each other. So, he gives one example of relations of production. As we have discussed before, relations of production is related to how two segments of society, for example, it is bourgeoisie or the proletariat, they interact with each other, not only at the level of factory floor, but also outside of it, which means that the relations of production are essentially organizing factors through which human interactions in a society are related to each other. And if we look at the relationship between bourgeoisie and the proletariat and link it with Marx's idea of class, relations of production is always about exploitation. Unless and until the bourgeoisie exploits the labor of the proletariat, no surplus can be generated. And if there is no surplus, that means capitalism as a system or as a structure cannot reproduce itself. That is the reason why base is so significant, and that is the reason why Marx calls class struggle as the motor of history. If you remember, we had discussed this timeline in which we had primitive communism, we had slavery, we had feudalism, we had capitalism, we had socialism, and then we had modern form of communism. And this is always an arrow of history. That means it moves in a unilinear direction. And in each one of them, except primitive communism, in all other aspects of society, we have something called class struggle. That is the reason why he is talking about motor of history. Now, this is a very straightforward argument in which there is class struggle because there are contradictions within classes and within the structure itself, and when these class contradictions become too prominent, then there is a revolution, and through this revolution the base is reformed into a new structure, and this happens through the class in itself to class for itself. Now, class in itself comes from base, because if there are 20 individuals, they are working on a shop floor as laborers, so they are exploited, or whatever incentives they are getting, it's almost the same. So they have certain consciousness that all of them are in together at the work site. Now, just look at yourself when you're watching this video, and think of yourself when you're watching this video. How do you feel when you are inside your classroom? If you're inside your classroom, do you feel there is a solidarity between all of you, or there are certain individuals or there are certain groups within the class itself which have more solidarity over others? That solidarity is primarily because you are part of a certain class, of whatever the degree that you are talking about. Secondly, what if there is a hike in your annual fee or your semester fee, and you feel that this hike is unjustified, because all of a sudden, instead of paying 500 rupees per month or per semester, it has been increased to 50,000 rupees per semester. In terms of fees, probably for some individuals this is not a big shift, but for a maximum number of students this is something that is unaffordable. And if this is unaffordable, that means how are they going to negotiate with it? And this kind of a policy decision impacts not only one individual or a particular class of students, but the entire community of students in that specific college, university, or wherever that the students are located. Now, this is an example of common solidarity, and if there is a common solidarity that all of us, or let us say 99% of us, are going to be impacted by this, so what do we do? Maybe we are going to accept it, maybe some students will drop out, maybe some people will go and file a case in the court, but most often than not, students feel that this is impacting them as a whole. So they come together, they choose their own leaders, and they feel that this case is galvanizing themselves as a class for itself, because class for itself is a political project. It is about your consciousness of feeling togetherness. It is not just that because all of us like to eat pizza, so we have formed a separate group, or we like to go to a certain dhaba in the evening, that's the reason why we have formed a certain group. So there could be certain classes, there could be certain groups, but when it comes to class for itself, it's a political consciousness that something is impacting us as an entire group of people. While class in itself and class for itself are classic Marxian interpretation of base and superstructure, because consciousness is always about superstructure. If you remember the similar kind of the diagram that I had discussed previously when I had discussed Marx, that day we discussed that superstructure consists of ideology, and ideology is related to both the religious institutions, political institutions, legal institutions, and at the same time they are also related to educational institutions. So, when superstructure gets impacted, that is when a consciousness is created, and this consciousness leads to the transformation of the base itself. Engels, on the other side, looked at the role of the state, how state can impact the structure as well as consciousness of different kind of groups. That is the reason why state is very significant in the conceptualization of political sociology as well as conceptualization of class in matters of the Engels and his formulation. That is another reason why he argued that unless and until the proletariats take care of the state is always going to look after the interests of the bourgeoisie, because the state is nothing else but a representative of the bourgeoisie. The state is here is not an autonomous political entity. So hence we can very specifically say that class is dynamic, relational and historically situated. It cannot be outside of contexts that are historical. That is another reason why Marx and Marx's works are always have mostly been related to historical sociology apart from political sociology. Now, when we move from Marx, we have Weber and Bourdieu. Weber, when he discussed about society, he discussed in terms of stratification, how the society is stratified not just in terms of economy, but also in terms of status and political representation. And class for Weber is not regarding ownership of means of production. Rather, it is about your market position, how you can use your own class position in order to achieve something. But that is there it is. The question, as I gave the example of students within a classroom, as to some students like to go to party, some students like to go for political mobilization, certain students like to go for tea, certain students like to go to watch movies. And even if there is one class or one classroom of suppose say 100 students, you have 25, 25, 25 and 25, 4 different groups that are there. And if there are 4 different groups, if you look at the Weber, there is a possibility that it is not just because of their own taste that they are separate from each other. It could be because of the status they are holding. Somebody who is going to spend 10 rupees on a cup of tea, and there is somebody who can spend 500 rupees on a pizza, they are not from the same class. Then this class position also leads to status positions, because if you can afford to consume a certain kind of food or to have a certain kind of lifestyle, that means at the time of mobilization you would look at how it is impacting your status or your stand. What if you are the topper in your class, or you are a group of toppers in the class, let us say 1 to 10, and because of the fee hike certain students would like to go on a strike, and in terms of that strike they would like to see that the classes are not functioning, they would like to see that no teaching or administrative activities are happening. But you are the topper and you feel that if you participate in such a kind of protest, and in future if the institution or the administration of that institution is going to penalize the students who are participating, then it will jeopardize your career. This creates one status for you. The second group might feel that irrespective of whatever is happening, I have to fight, because if I do not fight, I am going to be completely debarred from this educational institution. Even the juniors or the offsprings who are going to come, they can never avail education. And this is not just about the class aspect, it is also about your status in terms of whether you are the first generation learner. If you are the first generation learner and you can afford, or you were able to afford 500 rupees per semester, and the moment it becomes 50,000, you are completely out of education scenario and you have to drop out. So for you, participating in this movement is far more significant than for somebody who can both afford it, as well as for whom getting a decent education is a stepping stone for something else. That is another reason why your economic position is not equivalent to a collective mobilization, because as we discussed with Marx, your context matters or your status matters. But if your political affiliation is with the ruling party, for example, and if you are with the ruling party, your connections go deep. Even if you participate in some mobilization, still no actions will be taken against you. So what in effect you are doing is that you are both getting good marks as well as you are getting recognition for whatever you are doing. So apart from your economic position, your collective mobilization is dependent on status and party. That your status and party, in other words, is what creates differences between groups within certain segments. So the simple example that I gave of the class is, it's the same or can also be extrapolated to the outside the state, outside the society, outside of the class in a particular society or many societies. Why revolutions do not happen, why collective mobilizations also do not take place. Now coming to Bourdieu, mixed Weber and Marx together as well as some other scholars, and he says that it's the volume of your capital which determines whether you will be participating in certain collective mobilization as well as your economic position than anything else. So even if the lack of or the low rate of volume of capital that you have reproduces inequality, but still it's the symbolism or the habitus from where you are coming from lets you decide whether to participate or not to participate, or whether you are convinced. So here I am talking about the third group of people who are convinced that mobility for certain groups as well as Marx for certain other group is inconsequential, because life is not just about Marx, life is not just about mobility. We are coming to this institution because we like to come to this institution, and the mobilizations is wrong because it destroys the academic harmony, it destroys the academic environment of the institution. So he would argue that we are talking about everyday forms of hegemony in which you have been socialized in a certain way that you feel that political mobilization, collective consciousness is for the people who are only out there to create trouble rather than doing something meaningful with their lives. So that is the reason why when Bourdieu and Weber look at the class, they look at it in terms of multidimensionalism, economic, cultural and political. It's not just economic. The third figure here is the Gramsci. Now, we had a detailed discussion about Gramsci, so I will not be spending much time on him and his ideas. But what Gramsci did was that he spoke about not just coercion, but about consent. How through consent hegemony is created and how consent is manufactured in the civil society, which impacts the political society. And in order for this consent and coercion to work, we have to have a war of position in which ideology becomes the key battleground. Because when we are talking about consent, it is not without coercion, and when we are talking about coercion, it is not without consent. And ideology is the one which says that if an administration is taking punitive measures against students, they are justified, because these students are disrupting the academic environment, they are disrupting the proper functioning or normal functioning of the institution. At the same time, they are hooligans. So, these hooligans need to be taught a lesson, but this lesson is not equivalent or not the holistic. So, everybody need not be punished. So, punish the leader, leave aside others. That way, without a leader, others will not participate. That is the reason why when consent is provided, it is usually active, negotiated and cultural. In other words, consent is not a blank check. It is always contextual. So, I will give support to you for this movement till the time it is non-violent, till the time classes are functioning, but we are gherawing only the administrative building. The moment we expand this and some form of violence happens, I am out of it, because I cannot take chances of going to the jail or getting rusticated or suspended from the institution. That is the reason why consent is always active and it is always negotiated, and as I said, it is cultural. Certain groups can sustain a movement for a very long time because they have the cultural capital. They have the language, they have the writing skills, and they know that the social position that they have, with that they can move back and forth to a greater extent, rather than somebody for whom this is a matter of life and death. So, the hegemony creates leadership. It's not just about domination, because the moment we speak about domination, as Ranjit Guha very clearly argues about the colonial state of India, it's mostly about coercion. And leadership, if it is only about domination, it can never translate itself to hegemony. Now, when we look at post-Gramscian worldview, now Gramsci wrote whatever he wrote in the late 1920s. But later day scholars have reused and repurposed and reinterpreted Gramsci through culture, because like the Bourdieu, Gramsci has also used culture as the site of struggle, as the site on which most of the politics happens. For example, Stuart Hall looks at race, media and cultural hegemony in the context of United Kingdom. How media justifies the racial inequalities and racial segregation, and how the culture, that is the so-called British culture, hides race as a problematic. In case you follow news media, remember what happened to the British royal family when one of the members accused the royal family of racism. So, the entire news media in Britain pounced on this person and claimed that she has just entered the royal family to destroy it, because she happens to be an American, and the way Americans understand racism is not how the British society understands racism. Now, if you look at Stuart Hall and his work, he would argue that it is through the form of cultural hegemony that this entire race and discourses on race are sidelined. Similarly, in the late 1980s and early 1990s, Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe, they reworked and called their work as post-Marxism. And post-Marxism looks at the idea of discourse and the idea of articulation. This is also a period in time when they were disillusioned with Marxism or the state-sponsored Marxism of Soviet Union, and Soviet Union had also disintegrated. So what did they do? They looked at different movements that were originating, movements in terms of feminist movements, in terms of race movements, in terms of color, in terms of different other aspects of movements, which we also call them as the new social movements, and how they can be brought together. Articulation means 1 plus 1 plus 1. How do you, this is articulation, this is articulation, how you are bringing them together in order to create something new, something more fascinating, and something that is not dogmatic about the base, or that is not dogmatic about economic the rationalities. So that is another reason why they argue that hegemony needs to be flexible. Unless and until it is flexible, it is prone to crisis. So the movement is that of counter-hegemonic blocks of workers, feminists and environmentalists. Then that is when you mean to negotiate it at the everyday level. And as we have been discussing through this entire course, we have to look at the everydayness of the political sociology, how politics works at an everyday level. So while we have those concepts, now look at political mobilization per se. So political mobilization is not just about feeling aggrieved. Political mobilization is also about action, and how actions create and how actions are institutionalized. It can be done through three framings: resource mobilization, leadership and framing processes. In terms of that, whether it is revolutionary, reformist or defensive movements. Resource mobilization can happen because any movement requires certain kind of resources. Resources for pamphlets, resources for bringing people together. For example, currently social media is being used as a form of the resource. So if you remember what happened in the Nepal, there were grievances that have been going on over decades, but the final straw on the camel's back was the ban on social media in Nepal, and the entire youth generation, or the so-called Gen Z generation, marched towards the capital, set the parliament, Supreme Court and every other the political building on fire. And for this you require resources. It cannot happen without resources. The moment resources are removed from the position, then there is a possibility that the movement will dissipate. Secondly, leadership. So leadership can be a class position, leadership could be a caste position, leadership could be an ideological position. Third and the final is that framing process. What are your demands? Are you aggrieved by corruption? Are you aggrieved by the environment? Are you aggrieved by your caste hierarchies or class issues? So when you frame it, you realize that whether it is leadership or whether it is resource mobilization, they can be brought together. And in this, class is only a catalyst. Your identity and culture can act as mediators for a collective agency. So the class hegemony mobilization, they are linked to each other through different aspects of society, aspects of ideology. So as we have discussed, class is about structural inequality, hegemony is about ideological mediation, mobilization is about agency and contestation. in which we have different examples, and one of the examples that I gave about Nepal. So the most interesting aspect of Nepal is that the people in power came to power through the same kind of violent mobilization. They were the far left, the Maoist groups. After long bloody battle in the different trenches, forested and urban locations in Nepal, they had come to power by dislodging the existing political parties as well as by dislodging the Shah dynasty. Now, when they came to power and they claimed to be a democracy, but there was so much of corruption, there was so much of other kind of issues that violence led to violence. It doesn't happen in the Indian context. Primarily, one argument that has been given by various scholars is because Indians are by nature followers of somebody like Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, and unless and until we are completely thrown out of our comfort zone, we will never retaliate with such kind of violence. That is the another reason why among all the post 1945 democracy, India is the most stable one, because by nature we are not violent. Now this could be a misnomer. It could also be that we argue that we are not violent by nature, but in reality we have different status positions, and because of the status positions, so we are fragmented and we can never come together on a specific purpose unless and until we have a leader like Mahatma Gandhi, or a person like Mahatma Gandhi who is able to bring so many other leaders together so that the entire mass of Indians go against a particular system and a particular form of ruling. So in terms of caste class, we have examples of DMK, BSP, SP that we have been discussing since the past 2 weeks, as well as what happened in the farmers' protest of 2020-2021, when certain laws were passed by the parliament, and they were protests for almost a year, to an extent that finally all the 3 laws were repealed by the state. So that is where mobilization, caste, class, they all come together. But if you remember, for its entire duration of 1 year, only once or twice it turned violent. Otherwise, it was a peaceful, non-violent movement. Because in a functional democracy, people have a right to protest, to mobilize, and if you go by the Marxist analysis, that is the role of a democracy in a capitalist society. That anytime there is a mobilization that is happening, let the mobilization happen, but never let that mobilization move outside of this equilibrium in which everybody is located. The moment these small waves become tsunamis, that is when you have a revolution. And in democracies, revolutions don't happen, because you have channels through which mobilizations can happen, and then for certain framings, for certain grievances. In the new form, you have digital capitalism, as I said about social media and what happens with social media, but the social media is also used in the 2 sides. One is for the mobilization, second is for surveillance. Now when they come together, then the state also has an immense amount of power. The big business, the media houses have a lot of power in order to surveil upon their populations, to see how they are doing and what work they are doing. So now to sum it up, we need to understand that when we are talking about class, we have to look at culture. Otherwise, anytime we reduce any movement to class, the movements will not be understood in its entirety. Second is that authoritarian power requires coercion, whereas democracy requires consent. But democratic rules can turn towards authoritarianism, and sometimes authoritarianism can also lead to move slightly towards democratic framing. So we need to understand whether it is democracy or it's the authoritarianism by looking at the degrees of coercion or the degrees through which coercion is manifested. The moment if it is not manifested, that means democratic forces are at work. So finally, this triad is significant for our understanding of political sociology in the 21st century, because unless and until we bring the different aspects and attributes of the class struggle, attributes of status struggle, attributes of political struggle, then we cannot understand political sociology in the first place, but at the same time we cannot even understand mobilization. So these are some of the questions that we can discuss at the end of this month in our live session. Also, if you would like, we can discuss these questions in our forum. And some of the arguments that I have made in this lecture have come from these texts, and you can also go through these texts, specific chapters from these texts, in order to understand further these dynamics. Thank you.